All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Women in Innovation's second programming event, where we are going to have a conversation with Laura Rippy from Green D Ventures. And we're going to start off with an introduction to venture capital and a discussion about Laura together before she joins us at 4:30. So just a couple of things going on in the WIN world before I hand it over to Ellie to give her introduction to venture capital and intro to Laura. First, the deadline for the mentorship program was last night. So hopefully everyone that was interested got a chance to apply. If you were unable to meet that deadline and are really interested in applying, please reach out to me and we will try to work something out. But in the future, just try to be careful of those deadlines because we're trying to give our team enough time to make those pairings. And besides that, next week, we do not have a programming event. And we're going to be sending out those mentorship pairings. So hopefully you will be able to meet with your mentor or mentee next week in lieu of a programming event. Other than that, I think that is pretty much all on my end. Again, thank you for everyone that could make it today. I know we've had a lot of events in a row, but we're really excited to kick off the term. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellie, and she's going to give an introduction, and then we'll have maybe time for a short discussion before Laura hops on the call.
Hi, my name's Ellie. I'm the content creator for Women in Innovation, and I'm really excited to share a little bit of background about venture capital and also how Green D Ventures fits into venture capital today. And Green D Ventures is the venture capital firm of which Laura Rippy is managing partner. So without further ado, I will share the screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, perfect. So what is venture capital? According to the Corporate Finance Institute, venture capital is a form of financing that provides funds to early stage emerging companies with high growth potential in exchange for equity or an ownership stake. And equity and an ownership stake are the same thing. So venture capital investments are normally characterized as high risk. So while 90% of startups fail, venture capital firms are looking for that 1 out of 10 investment that succeeds, and that's where they're getting their returns. Venture capital firms choose to invest in a range of stages of companies, starting from a seed stage, which is actually just a founder having an idea and pitching it, all the way to bridge stage, which is a very mature company, which is going to go public, or there's going to be a merger and acquisition, and they're looking for support in that. So overall, venture capital firms account for 5% of total startup funding and 7% of funding at high growth startups. So interestingly, that difference is kind of an indicator. Venture capital firms are both looking for the most successful startups, but also supporting startups so that they become the most successful. And another indicator of that is the fact that 37% of IPOs are actually because of venture capital funded companies. So definitely venture capital firms are having a really big impact on the entrepreneurship space and on innovation as a whole. So these are a few companies which you might recognize, which were funded through venture capitalism. And generally, venture capital firms have 2 different types of clients. So first, they have the general partners, who are the people who are contributing money to a fund and receiving the returns. And the venture capital would not be possible without these people. That's like where they're getting their funding, which they invest from. So normally sources of investment for a VC fund are either high net worth individuals, family offices, foundations, big corporations, endowment funds like Dartmouth's, pension funds, or funds of funds. So like the returns which a venture capital firm gets might be placed back into their fund. So interestingly, the other client which venture capital firms work with are the companies themselves, the portfolio companies. So again, these are a few of them. Interestingly, looking at the large and well-known venture capital firms, in many cases, they actually cater towards the company. So these are the home pages and identities of three very successful venture capital firms. As you can see, they're really promoting themselves as the source of success for entrepreneurship and companies. So, sorry, trouble continuing. These are some key attributes of what venture capital firms offer. First, venture capital firms offer strong network. So as you can see, connections are very important in entrepreneurship, and often venture capital has a very strong focus on team. So they're both choosing the companies they invest in based on the success and qualities of a team, and they're also promoting and supporting that team once they've invested. So often, like, venture capital firms are involved in like the hiring of a CEO or even the firing, which at times can be controversial. And the second aspect of a venture capital firm, which is very key, is the fact their scale. So the only reason they're able to invest in such high risk companies is because they have a large fund. So taking some losses is okay as long as they get that successful company at the end. Also, venture capital firms are deeply involved in diligence and research about companies. So actually, out of 200 companies that a venture capital firm may look at as a source of investment, they'll only choose 4 to invest in. And that's where a lot of the work gets done at venture capital firms, that research to see, is this firm going to be successful? How could we make it successful once we've invested? So they often contain deep sector knowledge of a particular industry. That's why you see venture capital firms like specializing in, say, healthcare, because they've developed connections and understanding of that industry to make sure that the companies they invest in will become successful in it. So how does Green D Ventures fit into this world of venture capitalism? Green D Ventures is a really exciting venture capital firm because they're a source of innovation in venture capital. According to Laura Rippy, who we'll hear speak soon, venture capital firms normally raise funding from endowments, pension funds, and insurance companies, which I talked about earlier. Mike Collins actually started Green D Ventures to give access to this venture capital asset class to the average accredited investor. So in a way, Green D Ventures is really democratizing venture capital. They're catering towards a different client than a standard venture capital firm. And the reason that they can do this is because they mitigate risk. So their portfolio is intentionally diversified by stage, sector, and geography, such that if one company is failing, they've spread their risk over a larger group of investments. And another way they mitigate risk is by co-investing alongside really accredited, top-performing venture capital firms. Kind of the mentality that, like, many minds are greater than one. And finally, because of their unique take on venture capital, Green D Ventures has had really broad impact. So they have 25 portfolio companies currently, and 1 out of 4 Dartmouth alums in the world actually subscribe to the Green D newsletter, which is really crazy to me. And finally, they are part of a fund called the Alumni Ventures Group, and that consists of many endowment-focused, not actually endowment-focused, but higher education-focused funds in the United States. And this is actually the most active venture fund in the US. So we are so lucky to have Laura Rippy speak today. and really excited to hear from her soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ellie. That was a really interesting and informative presentation. So we have lots of time before Laura comes, and we were planning on just doing an open discussion and chatting about, maybe any questions you guys have about either venture capital, Laura, her background, anything. We kind of wanted to open up the floor. We can even open up Google and I can share my screen if Ellie doesn't know the answer. And yeah, we just wanted to create a space to chat about venture capital and about Laura before she hops on the call. So I guess with that, does anyone have any comments or questions or want to kick us off in our discussion?
I'm really curious to know how people get involved in venture capital. Because like I came here, I really honestly didn't even know what this organization was, but I thought, oh, this is so cool. Like we're going to hear from this, this entrepreneur who's involved in venture capital. Like that's so cool. And I just said like, oh, I really want to learn more about economics and like the stock market and finances and investments and stuff like that. So this would be a really perfect opportunity. I'm really curious like how people get into that because I feel kind of like out of my depth here a bit.
Yeah, totally. That's a really great question. Ellie, do you have insights on that?
Yeah, I think that's a thing everyone feels a lot. I certainly do. But I think, interestingly, actually, Green D Ventures itself would be a really interesting entry point because there's an article in the D recently, but a good way to start thinking about venture capital is by looking at the diligence process. So that's like really kind of like a key foundation for venture capitalism because most of their time is spent either supporting companies or choosing the companies. And that process, if you get good at it, is kind of really what makes a venture capital firm successful. So I think one good way to kind of start thinking about how you might fit into venture capital, whether you would like venture capital, is to kind of get involved with research into startups and entrepreneurship. So that's definitely available at the Magnuson Center. And I know Green D Ventures itself is definitely like supportive of like entry point kind of level roles within that. So that's what I'd recommend.
Can I just add to that? Actually, I'm Sarah Morgan. I'm one of the program managers at the Magnuson Center, and we actually have a venture capital investment competition that we started our first undergraduate team last fall, and they actually placed first, and we're going to go to globals, and then the pandemic hit. And we have if you're interested, I can tell you certainly more about it if you want to set up an office hour with me, but you can actually in the fall of 2021 apply for a program where you go through a workshop series. We usually take about 24 students, and they work with a Dartmouth alum, Jim Foy, who actually is his class of 78, I think, but he actually is the director of the private equity and VC center at Tuck. And so he teaches this workshop series. So that's a way to actually be exposed. And as Ellie said, one of the main things they focus on is how to actually do due diligence. And as they're preparing for the competition, they actually work with startups that are in the process of trying to raise their first or second seed round.
Thank you so much. I would definitely love more information about that. I really love to do research on almost anything. Like I'll just pick a topic and I'll say, I want to learn more about this. And that's kind of how I spend a lot of my free time. So I feel like that could be something I'd really like to do, like learning more about companies and like what makes a company successful or what makes it likely to kind of go under.
Yeah, that's totally really an interesting path to go on, especially in your free time. I think one thing that's interesting about venture capital to me is that it's kind of this like mystery, at least to the undergraduate body, because it's very difficult to get sort of an entry-level job in venture capital coming from just a college background. And since they're investing so much of their money, since it's so high risk, high reward, they really look for, very specific criteria before they can hire someone. And I think that's changing a little bit. I know of some venture capital firms that are now hiring out of undergrad or have undergrad internship and post-grad options to apply. But for the most part, a lot of very big venture capital firms are, you apply in your mid-20s and your 30s. And that's sort of where you start out in venture capital. And I had a discussion actually with our speaker last week, Mark Bernfeld. When I first met him, I went to his office hours and I said I was really interested in venture capital, but I don't really know what it is. I was like, I'm interested in startups. I'm interested in how they get their funding. And, I could see that being something I'd be interested in my career. And I asked him how you get involved. And he was saying that it is very typical to go down one of two paths for someone that's becomes a venture capitalist. The first being an entrepreneur, so people that have started startups themselves and have experience, what works, what doesn't work, how do I develop my idea and make it a success, or coming from a traditional finance background, such as investment banking, and people that have that really hands-on technical knowledge of, okay, how do I look at a company's financial statements? How do I analyze whether they're profitable, whether this is a good investment? And I think traditionally those tend to be the two paths to venture capital, which is what makes it kind of this murky, unclear profession for people our age. But yeah, I think that's changing, and it's really interesting and exciting for us to have this opportunity to speak with Laura so she can, put us on the fast track and give us the scoop on venture capital when, it's difficult to get that otherwise.
I would also add, I'm also like really interested in venture capital and actually participated in the VCIC and like really want to do this in the future. And another thing that I've been doing, and maybe I obviously don't know much, but just talking to people who do venture capital as a living. So, like 5 people on LinkedIn who are Dartmouth alumni who are obviously like more than willing to talk to you, or anybody else like on LinkedIn, or people who might be in your network or just outside of your network who are in venture capital, just talking to them about, what their career path was like, what got them there, any skills that they might recommend learning beforehand, or even if they could connect you with somebody else in the industry, that's always really, really helpful. And I've had some really great conversations with people. So not that I know much at all, but that is something I would also recommend.
Yeah, that's great advice. Any other questions or comments before we have Laura hop on in around 10 minutes?
I have like a general question. Like,
Yeah.
how was your experience with like getting to know venture capital and like, like your journey to where you are today?
For Laura?
I would like to know about you because I feel like
About
you,
me?
yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm so flattered. Yeah, so my experience with venture capital is pretty limited, to be honest. I've never worked in the field, put that out there first. Like I just mentioned, my really first introduction to venture capital was when I walked into office hours with Mark Bernfeld, and I'd heard of one venture capital firm, whatever that meant, was doing recruiting. This was my sophomore year, so now 2 years ago. And I walked into his office and I was like, oh, this seems like a really interesting field. Like, can you tell me about it and how I would be someone with the qualifications to get a job in this industry? And he gave me the answer I just explained, which was two paths, being one being entrepreneurship and the second being finance. And I hadn't really thought about either of those for myself. And now I feel like I'm working with both of them, which is kind of funny. So Mark actually encouraged me to apply to the Magnuson Center Student Leadership Board, which I'm now a part of. And that gave me a lot of experience working with startups and understanding putting on programming to help Dartmouth students engage with startups and entrepreneurship. And that's been a really rewarding experience. And also, he encouraged me to maybe look into finance if that was, if my end goal was, you know, working with investing and working with startups, that might be a helpful tool to have. And yeah, so I'm working as an investment banker next summer, or sorry, last summer I did an internship, and I'll be going back for full time this summer. So that was sort of my introduction to venture capital. But again, I don't, I'm no expert. I was just a student with some interest. And yeah, I'm really excited that you guys are interested in it too. And really excited to hear from Laura. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
No problem.
I just threw in a quick thing that just occurred to me. The private equity and VC center at Tuck is actually holding a conference February 1st to the 5th, and they've invited undergraduates to apply. So I've just thrown that into the chat. If you guys want to go to that, you can meet all kinds of people.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Sarah. One other thing, I'll just echo what Daria said about reaching out to alums on LinkedIn. If you are really interested in venture capital and private equity and you want to chat with someone who works there, obviously this is a great opportunity to do that. But also I've had a bunch of conversations through the Magnuson Center and through LinkedIn with alums in the space, and they've been really helpful and really interesting, and that's a really good opportunity as well. But yeah, any other questions or comments, or just want to chat or hang out? We can like take a 5-minute break as well before Laura comes if people want to get water. Or stretch their legs. I know being on Zoom for long periods of time can be tiring and less engaging, but yeah, this is totally our time to chat and regroup before Laura comes.
And just an add-on to kind of engaging with venture capital, I think one interesting opportunity I've looked into is that Kleiner Perkins, a venture capital firm, offers a fellowship, and it's actually geared towards undergraduates, which is pretty unique. So if you're interested in that, would definitely recommend looking at it.
Yeah, that's great. Another thing we can do, you know, like we're still figuring out all of our resources and programming. Another thing we can do is if there's interest, we can compile as part of our content some venture capital opportunities that are open to undergrads. So the one Ellie just mentioned is a great one. I know there's a firm, a tech-based firm in New York called the Insight Venture Partners that recruits at the undergraduate level. And yeah, we'd be happy to put together that and distribute that to our members. And one other thing before Laura gets here is that we've created a Slack channel for our community. And maybe Daria, do you want to introduce the Slack channel and maybe give everyone the link to join?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sending it in the chat. So essentially a big part of WIN is to create a community of women who like support each other and just to lead discussion in topics about like entrepreneurship and venture capital. And so we wanted to create a space where we could hold that discussion, you know, all the time and to start building a community. So yeah, we just created a Slack channel where you guys are more than welcome to join. And feel free to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your interests, and feel free to ask questions or drop resources, and we'll continue to kind of develop and facilitate conversation within the Slack group. But this is kind of our first step into really making WIN feel like a community and making sure that you all feel like you're a part of it, and feel like your voices are heard, and we're all contributing to a bigger discussion. So yeah, feel free to join the link that I just sent in the chat, and let me know if you have any trouble with joining.
Yeah, I would really encourage everyone that's interested in when to join. That'll be where we have more of our community building oriented programming and just chatting. I know we can't get together in person right now, but that's where we're going to try to establish a community where we can encourage this innovative space and support each other. And even if there's questions like, what is a venture capital opportunity for undergraduates, that could be put in the Slack channel, or like we'll start by sending out, the exec board will maybe start by sending out just like a selfie and an intro, and hopefully everyone else will want to do that too, just a picture and where you're from, and just so we can all get to know each other a little bit better. And hopefully, obviously complying with the school's restrictions and the CDC's guidelines, we can do maybe a socially distanced walk around Ockham Pond, or something that would help us build some kind of in-person relationship as well. So we'll be posting about those in the Slack channel too, and other opportunities to just get to know each other, either virtually or maybe in small groups in person. So yeah, great. So we only have 2 minutes. So maybe we'll just take the next 2 minutes to kind of relax, refresh, and get ready for Laura. So whatever you need to do, but please try to come back in 2 minutes so that Laura can enter with a full room. Thanks, guys. All right, everyone. So I'm about to let Laura into the Zoom room. So here she is, and I hope you guys are excited to hear from her. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, good to be here.
We're so excited to have you. We've spent the first half hour of our meeting talking about what is venture capital, and how do undergraduates get involved and how do you learn about it more. So we are ready to hear from you, ready and excited. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you again for coming. We're so excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So can I ask for a little round robin of questions in the chat? Can we start with that, just to give me a couple of prompts? Because I'm curious, I want to make this useful for everybody here. And I'm happy to walk through a little bit of my background and kind of advice as you get kicked off in your careers. But I also want to be sensitive to what questions you might have. So if you have anything for the chat, I am very open to that. And would really welcome it. So I think if I have a full view, I think I have everybody here. So just by way of introduction, I graduated in '89. Right now, I am very fortunate to run Green Bee Ventures, which is a venture capital fund that is particularly focused on the Dartmouth community. So hopefully you will remember that as you go off and you start things, that you will come back to me and say, please write me a check for my business. So that's an important piece of what I want to make sure you remember. And then I also want to mention that the organization that I'm part of more broadly was started by a Dartmouth alum. So it's a neat story. It's called Alumni Ventures Group, and it was started 5 years ago by Mike Collins, who's a class of '86. And in those 5 years, we are now we've grown. We have $500 million assets under management, and we are the single most active venture capital firm in the country. So kind of a neat Dartmouth story. So, but so that's where I am now. And so I appreciate joining all of you here today and wanted to share a little bit about sort of how I got there. I think I got one question on that front. So if I saw it breeze by, so how did I get started? Venture capital is a really amazing field, right? It's basically you are investing in the future. You're investing in companies that are getting started, and they have in common that they have ambitious goals. The companies in which we invest, they're growing really fast, and they often don't have a lot of proof yet that they're going to be amazing. So it requires a lot of imagination. Right. So I have an incredibly fortunate and really fun role right now at Green D Ventures. The way I got there is typical for most venture. So most venture investors, there's kind of two paths. One path is folks who come to venture capital investing with a history of being an investor. So there's a woman that was on my team up until recently, Lacey Johnson. She went to Tuck, and her whole career was as an investor. So from the beginning, she was looking at companies, and that's, analyzing what their potential is, looking at their business model, assessing their teams, and her whole career was as an investor. So my career is a little different, but is also an archetype in venture, and that is I come from more of an operator background. So I came out of Dartmouth and did a little bit in consulting, went to business school, and then very quickly became an operator. I was at Microsoft, and then I was a CEO, and then I helped about a dozen companies as an executive in the Boston area, board levels roles and executive roles there. And that's the other path to venture, is basically you get there because you've kind of built businesses and you can help companies because of the counsel that you provide, or you go down the path of being an investor and you go, sort of build your expertise in choosing the right companies by always being the one that writes the check. So both are totally valid and provides for good venture investors. It's just those are the two most typical archetypes when you look at venture capital investors. So would it be helpful if I went through a little bit of kind of maybe some advice as you come out of Dartmouth, things to look for in first careers, if that would be helpful? I think mix of years, if I remember correctly, you guys are across, you're not just sort of second, third. I mean, what year is, can everybody put up fingers with like what year you're in, like first, second? Okay. All right. So there is, oh, good. See, we can do this. Good. Okay. First year, Emma, there we go. So good. So I think my advice coming out, and at least what I did and I would replicate, is to think about your first years out of school and to come out very aggressively. So when I was maybe like, it was in my first year out, I read this Wall Street Journal article, and it really impressed me. So it basically said, if you think about wanting to be a woman that maybe has a family and also has a career, part of what you have to recognize is there might be times where, because you're in the middle of having the kids, you maybe you take a couple of years where you're not as sort of on a steep trajectory. And so what the advice was in this Wall Street Journal article that I took to heart was, if you go really, really steep and intense in your career in your early 20s, then you can get to a point where maybe you can basically take a trophy, take a moment where you've kind of secured a title, a position, a level, an accomplishment, that if then you kind of have a couple years where you're not quite on that steep trajectory and then you come back in, it will have looked as though you've sort of made that whole journey in a straight line. Does that make sense? So I'll use an example. So when I first came out of Dartmouth, I went into strategy consulting, which I really liked, and at the time was a good fit for me because I knew I wanted to do something in business, but I didn't know what flavor. And it was a consulting firm that was very entrepreneurial. So it had been a spin-off of a big one, BCG, and it was really scrappy in that sense. And in particular, when I joined it, the company had this weird thing where the two founders had sort of split. And so when I joined, we basically had to go beat the bushes and go get business. really early. And so even though it was like we didn't know anything about consulting, we were going to do business development in part to kind of fill the coffers and get projects going. And so while I wanted to go into consulting to understand how business worked, and because it seemed like a good application of liberal artsy stuff, it meant that I started in a company that was very entrepreneurial and moving and going intensely fast. And I was willing to work really, really hard. So I moved up quickly and I got a lot of responsibility. And I took some risks there. I went to go work in East Germany when the wall was coming down, which was a very much kind of, there really wasn't any place to catch me. This was a very kind of, out there sort of role, and without a lot of kind of scaffolding to help me in what I was doing. And as a result, because I did that, and I pushed really hard and I worked really hard, I then did get into Harvard Business School, and that was a great accelerator as well. So I was the youngest 10% of my class at HBS. And then from there, I went, when I was at Harvard Business School, most of the roles were either consulting or investment banking. And I'd done consulting and I didn't want to do investment banking. So I was looking for something else. And I was lucky enough to figure out there was a Microsoft internship. And that was when Microsoft was kind of cool, but was still early days. So for instance, of my business school career, in my class, there were like 850 people and 650 people applied for the internship, and 2 of us got it. So I took that, right? And then I went to Microsoft and I worked wicked hard there. So again, on this kind of steep trajectory. So when I went to Microsoft, I started in a new group, and then I founded another group, and then I founded another group. And by the end, I was the youngest GM, which is called general manager at the time at Microsoft. So again, like, consulting, but not like an easy consulting, take some risks. And then I went to HBS, and even though, gosh, that sounded kind of terrifying at the time, I did that and I did it well enough so that then I went to Microsoft. And again, I pushed really hard. And I'm not just saying hard work, but like push yourself, like really to say, I'm not like exploring and loosey-goosey. I'm actually going to try to make something happen. And as a result, I kind of got to this point. And then around that time, I got married, and my husband and I had a deal. He had come out to Seattle for my job, and I said I would move for his. And we moved to Dallas, and Microsoft was really great and took care of me and put me in a super interesting role. But I got a recruiter call to be a CEO. And I was terrified because, of course, what the heck am I doing? I'm like 29 and like, what do you mean a CEO? Like, what? But I took that risk and I became a CEO. And then it's a venture-backed company. We raised money, raised $15 million. We got to profitability. Like, great story in that. But again, pushing really hard on that trajectory steep, so that in my early 30s, when I decided I did want to have kids, I left with that kind of trophy that I had been a CEO, and I'd been a super young CEO, and nobody could take that away. I had my HBS degree, I had my Dartmouth degree, I had this experience of starting 3 businesses at Microsoft, I had consulting experience, I had international experience. That was a lot to accomplish in, basically a decade. And so what it meant is that I did have some time where I could, I wanted to have kids, and it's pretty hard to have kids if you're on a plane all the time. And so I figured out a way where I was doing this board work where I could control my schedule and my kids could be, still in the picture, and I could kind of do some interesting stuff with my brain, but I could still be involved in their early days. And so I was able to have the kids and do that for a stint, and then come back in later in the workforce. But I could come in because I had these trophies from that really steep trajectory coming out of the gates. So that was a little bit of a longer answer than I think I intended to say, but I hope that gives you a sense of kind of that early. That would be the counsel: is whatever the heck you do, press on the gas, and take the opportunities and push for the promotion, and grab what you can. because it is the easiest to come out of the gate hard, and then everyone will sort of expect that of you later. It's a lot harder, I think, when I look at my peers who sort of took a while to figure out what they were really sort of into or whatever. Like, they never quite got sort of escape velocity in terms of career trajectory in the same way. So I would really counsel that. Oh, look at all these cool questions. Okay, great. So women in VC. So let's talk through that. So I am a class of '89, so you can do the math on how old I am. But let's just say, so at Dartmouth, 40% of my class was female. In consulting, it was a reasonably mixed consulting firm, but I went to go work in Germany, and there was no one who was a woman, who was none, like zero. Like, there was like one secretary. I mean, it's all men. Then I went to HBS, and 30% of my class was women. Then I went to Microsoft, and I don't know what the numbers were at that time, 10, 20%, something like that. And then I was a CEO, and you know the numbers now about female CEOs, they're much better. I think at the time it was something like 2 to 4% of venture-backed companies were led by women. And the story now is that while there are more women that are CEOs of venture-backed companies, they don't get as much capital. So if it's like 20, 25% of the women, they get like 5 to 10% of the capital. So if it was 4%, maybe on a good day, if venture-backed companies were led by women, there's a whole lot less that were getting money. And I raised $15 million. So that's still a relatively large check. So, so all that to say that, yes, I have a little experience of being an anomaly. But what I would say, and I think the best example of this is when I was a CEO, is that because I am female, and all of us are, and if that means that you are fairly unusual, it means that you have an unfair advantage. So the way it panned out for me as an unfair advantage when I was a CEO is in a couple of examples I can give, is that you stand out. Like, if I went to a conference and I was the only female CEO speaking at a conference, then anybody who heard my speech remembers that it was me, right? They're going to have generic piles of men up there that all look the same, and I was the only woman presenting. And the same thing fundraising. Like, I get so many pitches, right? So many pitches as a venture capitalist, people coming to me to write them a check. But, I remember the ones that are anomalous. Wow, I haven't talked to somebody like that before, particularly when it's as easy as gender, right? So I really stuck out. They would remember me. And then the other part is from press. So I got a ton of press when I was a CEO very easily, and got speaking opportunities, all those things, because gosh, I'm this fresh-faced, whatever it was, 31-year-old CEO of a fast-growing company in Dallas, Texas. There's just nobody else like me, right? So as far as that's concerned, in terms of being female in venture, female in tech, female in any of your situations, I don't know what the example is now, but I'd say turn it around and say you have an unfair advantage, and look at it that way, because that's the way I always did. I had an unfair advantage. I was more memorable. I have more opportunities that come to me because of it. So next one from Daria. This might be quite a big question. What makes a startup successful? What do you look for in a startup before starting to invest? So love that question. So in terms of investing in startups, so I don't think there's one answer. I think it's the alchemy that comes together. So some things that we look at is the total addressable market that you're looking at. So in venture and a startup, really so any other kind of business that you're starting, it doesn't have to be quite this dramatic, but for a venture-backed company, the money that's going in expects that you have very big ambitions and you are going at a really big opportunity. If you don't think this can be a $1 billion business, don't waste my time, right? Is the way a lot of venture capitalists sort of position it. So that's one thing, is you're going at a big problem. Second thing is the team, right? So what is it about the team and the chemistry that is going to make this successful? So I particularly have seen in my life that diverse teams overachieve. So when a company comes to me and they haven't figured that out yet, I'm skeptical. If they don't have a team that is somewhat diverse in some ways, and And, you know, when you only have 3 or 4 people, there aren't that many sort of parameters that you can be diverse on. But is it backgrounds? Is it gender? Is it anything else that we can see? Or is it stuff under the hood that makes their brains different? Because I have absolutely seen, you know, a great example when I was a CEO, you know, we're in Dallas, Texas, and Motorola came down. They've been a partner. And they at the end of the meeting, they kind of threw out this thing. It was sort of like a stump the chump thing. It was like, hey, we have this problem. Would you guys be willing to look at it? You know, we kind of pay you a little bit to take a look at it, but we're really stuck. We can't get this thing done. And we were like, hey, we're scrappy and you're going to throw money at us. Yeah, we'll take a look at it. Yeah, sure. We'll do it. Right. So we did it. And my team put some effort into it. You know, I don't know, we were like 50 people at that point. So we had like maybe a little tiger team, 2 or 3, 4 people that looked at it to solve it. But in my team, they were inherently diverse, right? Like, so I had a very healthy mix on my technical team of people that even now would qualify for a diverse team. And we cracked the code of the problem. We cracked it in a matter of weeks. We got back to Motorola. They were floored. They flew down. They were like, what? And they looked at it and they said, we've spent $19 million on a team in Seattle. It's a bunch of bros, and they haven't been able to figure it out. And you guys look at it in a matter of weeks and you cracked it. They were floored, right? And I think that was an example of diversity. We had a really heterogeneous set of teams. I mean, I had, you know, one guy that, you know, would look like a traditional sort of Texan or whatever if you just looked at him, but it just so happened that he had probably mild Asperger's. And so he was genius on some things, right? And then we had, you know, women that looked, you know, different. We had just a variety of folk on that team. And I think because people come, you know, as an immigrant, you know, there's just a whole bunch of people that kind of got together and came to an answer. So as far as I'm concerned, like the second thing, you know, beyond, certainly beyond, you know, total addressable market is the team smart, and is it diverse, and are they looking at this in an unusual way? You know, beyond that, with a startup, you know, are you solving a pain point would be the third thing, right? So when I look at startups, if it's sort of a nice to have, or this is kind of important, but not really, like there's nobody who's like, I'm trying to solve this problem. There's this thing that happens. There's this friction. There's this whatever. If you're not solving a problem, then I don't think as a venture capitalist, you're really going to ever get the right amount of capital to, you know, it's not going to attract capital. So those would be 3 that I look at, you know, total addressable market team, and certainly, you know, whether or not it's a pain point. I mean, there's other nuances, right? Like, you know, are there moats? Can you be protected, right? Is there something about IP or your unfair advantage because you have special knowledge that is great? And as the companies go through their life cycle, do they have evidence of traction that you can see that they have kind of, they're onto something, that there's sort of something viral about what they're doing, or they have early customers, or there's measures of traction? Those would probably be 4 and 5 behind it. But that's kind of the start. So that was a great question, Daria. Okay, from friend Francesca, what would you rank for women who are choosing between venture capital or private equity as a career after investment banking? Okay, you just asked the wrong person, Francesca, because I wouldn't do any of those things. And I don't actually know. I don't know if she is, I can't see her to say that. So there you are. So I think, so for me, my path is much more of like, I was a doer. Like at Dartmouth, I was, I don't know, a president of probably half a dozen different things. And I organize stuff, and I like, that's more me than sort of just the pure analytical. So I'm probably the wrong person to answer that. But within it, I would say that venture capital, I think the best venture capitalists tend to come from some practitioner time in the startup world. So if you truly want to start with investment banking, that probably leads better to private equity. So private equity, to me, there's a ton of money to be made. There aren't enough women in it. It's a very good path to go to really break some ground. But what you have to realize is the kinds of companies you invest in typically with private equity are much later stage. It's some, you know, distribution company, or you're going to come in and you're going to squeeze some money out of the model. You're going to make it a little more efficient, right? And maybe they are going to acquire another company to get scale. Those are the kinds of problems you solve. With venture capital and the startup world, you are just changing the world. That's it. You're just changing the world. That's the only thing you're doing. And as far as I'm concerned, I'd rather wake up every day and work with teams that are changing the world, as opposed to squeezing a little money out of this distribution company, or sort of getting scale, or like firing people. Like, look, that is not me. But it is a very lucrative field. There needs to be more women in it. There can be more humane, private equity, I think, over time. So all of my dissing aside, I have lots of friends in it. It's a good field. They're lovely people. So I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek, but for me, investment banking to private equity makes more sense, only because you're working at big company to big company, as opposed to kind of coming into this world of startup land. Could you talk about your decision to go to business school and how you feel an MBA accelerated your career over 2 more years of hands-on work experience? So that's great. So the why an MBA. Okay, so putting myself back into that position. So what happened was, as I said, I joined this little startup consulting firm, and in between when we got the job offer and when we started, everything hit the fan and we were all thrown at business development, right? I told you that part. And then I did this 2 years there where it was fascinating. I loved it. Consulting was so interesting. But what I felt like for me is that I would do these projects where I would study one little part of the body. Like I'd be studying the elbow for 3 months. The elbow's really cool, right? But I'd be studying the elbow. And then the next project, I'd be studying like the nervous system of the right hip or whatever, right? Or maybe how toes work or something. And it's like this disparate sense. And so for me, what I was hungry to do when I went to business school is I wanted to understand the whole Körper, if you know German, right? The whole body. Like I want to understand how the respiratory system works, the skeletal system works. I want to understand how they all fit together. So for me, I was missing the comprehensiveness. And so I went to business school in part because of that. I was hungry to learn how it all fit together. My second reason for going to business school is that when I was in consulting, as I said, I went to Germany. So I had been almost a German double major. I took a lot of classes at Dartmouth in it. And I was also a government major undergrad. And the fall after I graduated was when the wall came down. And so I sat there in my little business suit in Boston, seeing this tumultuous thing happen as a government major who knew German, and the wall was coming down and perestroika was happening. And I'm sitting here like making PowerPoints. Awful, right? And so whole reason why I got to go to Germany is because the boss of the firm happened to be German. He saw that I was interested in this and came into my office one day and said, "Hey, Laura, I hear you're interested in what's happening in Germany." And he said all this, by the way, with a funny German accent, which I'm not going to try to do. But he said, I hear you're interested in going to Germany. Do you want to go over there? And I said, yes. And he came back in 20 minutes and he said, great, I have a project for you in East Germany. Pack your bags, you'll start in a week. Right? And I was like, whoa, like I thought I was about to get fired, but instead I went over to Germany. Okay. So when I was in Germany, as I had said before, like only female, really the only person under 30, and I was like 22. I was the only American. I'm like a freak of nature. They have no idea what to do with me, right? Like I am like, you've got to be kidding. This person also speaks German and she's telling us how to do business stuff. Like they could not compute. These are people who have been living under an Soviet regime for whatever it was, decades, right? And then the West Germans that I was working with, they also didn't know a whole lot about American systems. And so the business card that I had my name, and in Germany, you put your degree and your school on it. So it had my AB government and it said Dartmouth College. And here I was like so proud. I'm like, I wear the green. I'm like, I went to Dartmouth, right? These Germans, they had no idea what Dartmouth was, not a speck. So in German, I'm like going through this whole thing of like, it's kind of like Harvard, it's kind of like Yale. Do you know Princeton? Like I'd go through these conversations and they're like looking at me blankly. They knew Harvard, I don't know what else they knew. They knew Harvard is really what it came down to. And I decided if I wanted a career in international business, which I was kind of thinking this is pretty cool, I needed to maybe do something about this because nobody's going to know Dartmouth. So when I came back from that assignment in Germany, this little consulting firm was actually truly hitting the fan and really in a downward spiral. And so the three of us that were still there, that were kind of fresh undergrads, we all applied to do other things. And I applied to Harvard and Stanford. and figured if I got in, I'd go. And I also applied to go do economic development in England, this job that I found at the back of The Economist, and I got into Harvard. So I went. I took the summer off and I traveled and I had great. But like for me, it was really those drivers of I wanted to understand how business worked. And then I also wanted to have something that was credible. And so for me, having the HBS degree opened doors because I wanted to be able to sort of have that for my whole life. Okay. What advice would you have when choosing whether to commit to a smaller startup versus a larger, more established corporation for both post-college and internships? So thank you, Ellie. So I actually think coming right out of school right now, going into a company, particularly like a fast-moving tech company, is a pretty cool idea. So I learned so much at Microsoft, so much that I use. I probably learned more at Microsoft than I learned at HBS or in my consulting or even being a CEO. And part of it was Microsoft was at the tip of the tip of the tip of its coolness at that point. Like I know it's not cool now, so I'm not going to pretend that it is, right? But like if you kind of stirred the pot and said like what Google and Apple and Facebook and I don't know, Instagram, and like if you stirred it all together and had like one company, that's how cool Microsoft was at the time. And that's indicative of that, you know, the fact that 650 people applied and only 2 got in. It's more that there were 650 people who wanted to go work for this company, right? So there were just so many brilliant people, and I learned things that I didn't expect to learn. And so I really feel like if you can get into a program where they really are well known for teaching you a lot in a short amount of time, I think going into one of those established things can be magical, absolutely magical. And it's not to say I didn't learn a lot from being in the startup consulting firm. They're raw things that I learned there too. But there's something to be said for being in a place where they're doing things right and learning from that and taking the advantage. And you know, going in, you have a Dartmouth degree. There's going to be like 20 people that start at the same time. Expect to be the number 1 person by the end of 6 months, right? Like that's that steep trajectory. Is you have a peer group then and crush it versus the other folks that are there. I think you can achieve just as much doing that. Okay. What advice would you give to first-year students in terms of short-term and long-term career planning? Wow, that's a stumper. I have to think about that. So what I did, which was pretty useful, is I had very meaningful internships all the time. So I, when I was in high school, I worked at my local library, and then I became a bank teller. So I had like a real job before college. And then my first summer I worked at GTE because I'd been a National Merit Scholar, and they had things available for that. And then I worked in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and then I had an internship at Tuck, and I'm probably missing something else in there. But like the point being that like when I did real jobs, like I had real solid internships. So I think that would be a focus area, is to say not less so what classes you take, because really you're just getting your brain like juiced up on everything, right? Like I don't know, I got as much out of my Japanese art class, I think, as I certainly learned more than I did from my economics class, from which I learned nothing. But like there's so much like it's so good. Dartmouth is such a phenomenal place, and especially now, I guess the one thing I do on campus right now, if I had to do it over again, is the state of the state with Thayer and Dolly and the Magnuson Center. I would go smush myself in there somewhere, because there is particularly, I don't know how many of you have met Alexis, who is the new dean at Thayer. She's a friend, and she really believes in the liberal arts approach to engineering, right? Like the world is pumping out people who are specialists, right? Like if you've read the book Range, I don't know if anybody's read the book Range, but it's great, or listen to the podcast. And the Range is the theme of Range is called, or the headline is How to Succeed as a Generalist in a World of Specialists, which is just about classic liberal arts, right? Because we're taught pattern finding, right? That's what you're doing, pattern finding and writing and communicating and distillation of data, all of that good stuff. You have this unfair advantage going out to the world when you leave with the Dartmouth education. And I think a little bit of the engineering piece is interesting because that's really the way she's thinking about, and having the professors do it, is to apply the liberal arts approach to engineering, not be super narrow and nerdy, right? Not that there's anything wrong with super narrow and nerdy, but just to say you can do that and you can be, you know, horizontal in your knowledge. And one interesting, back to the prior question about where to go in, I think one fabulous place for liberal arts people to go in is that product manager role in tech startups, because it requires you to have some subject matter depth in whatever part of the product that you're sort of deep on, but you also need to understand the market implications and be able to communicate it. And as a product manager, you are kind of the Schlüssel, if you know the German word, to getting a product sort of off and running and being kind of the sort of the hub of the spoke. And it requires a lot of the skills that liberal arts people tend to have, and I think is just a great entree point. These are so good, guys. What advice would you give to, and okay, so I didn't realize that Sarah Morgan was a German major too. She's a friend of mine, so that's great that she came from the Magnuson Center. So, so good. Wow, those are the questions. So what else you got? Or do we have more? Did I miss more?
Laura, do you have more time for us? I know we're at 5:03, so I don't want to, or 5:03 Eastern. I don't.
Yeah. So I mean, if there's, I mean, we ended with all the questions. I mean, I can go a little bit longer. I do have to sort of go and do family stuff, but I hope this was helpful.
This was incredible, Laura. You are such an inspiring figure, and thank you so much. I can say, at least for myself, I've learned so much just in the past half hour, and really appreciate the time you've taken.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it. And if you guys are looking for other speakers or whatever, there's other women out there that are pretty amazing. Yeah. So I'm glad you guys are getting started off. I hope you do that steep trajectory thing.
Yeah, well, you've helped us hit the ground running, and you'll be a tough act to follow for sure for our next speaker. But I guess we'll let you get on with your family time and have a great weekend. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you everyone that made it here today. I really appreciate all of the you know, encouragement, engagement, and all of the advice that you've given us, Laura.
Yeah, absolutely. Good.
Great. Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Thank you.